Hello, and welcome to Critical Faculty. It's been quite a while. It's been about 5 or 6 months since I've had my latest conversation in English. I had one yesterday in Arabic for the first time. Yeah, I've had a bit of much needed rest from social media and the big debate. However, I can only hide for a while. I needed to come back and discuss the current affairs and the situation that is boiling over in the Middle East. This situation has lots of roots: philosophical, political, religious, you name it. It's quite complex. And no matter where you stand on that particular situation, you're bound to be threatened and blamed for your position. But we don't care. And I've got another person who really doesn't care, and he only will say what he believes, is the magnificent Jonathan M.S. Pierce. How are you, Jonathan?
Hey, Hanney, it's really good to be back. And quite frankly, I'm not sure you should have come back yet. I think I would have taken a couple more months off because this is a crazy time in world history. As you probably know, I have been obsessed with the Ukraine-Russia conflict for a year and a half. I have ATP Geopolitics as my geopolitical channel that's been looking in depth every single day. I haven't had a day off for over a year looking at that, including Christmas Day. So I'm obsessed with that. And then along comes the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it's, oh my goodness, right? So much that there are connections to the two, but it's such a difficult conflict to get your head round. But it has deeply divided people, polarized people, and unfortunately, people like good guys and bad guys, or one side or the other, black and white. And it's not a conflict that lends itself to that kind of narrative, and that's why people, I think, are having a real issue with getting their heads around it.
Sure. And look, today we're not going to shy away from the difficult questions because there's so many difficult questions, and ethics are going to be sort of in question here, and the reaction from world leaders, countries, and their best interests, and the background of this, because this is not your ordinary conflict over a bit of oil or a bit of influence. This has been rooted in the human consciousness for quite some time. Maybe take us through what the origins of this debacle.
Well, I think the first thing to say, and I said this in my series that I'm doing on this conflict on my Atypical Philosopher channel, which is check your biases first. So all of us are going to be bringing biases to this, like whether it's our own demographic, like okay, so who am I? I'm a white male secular humanist guy from Britain, and all of that and everything else that's attached to my identity. That will inform how I evaluate what's been going on here, not least because actually Britain are heavily involved in the history of the region, particularly in the 20th century. And so I need to check my biases to make sure that I'm not evaluating things in light of who I am, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible. Someone who might be a Muslim from Saudi Arabia will have a completely different way of evaluating this, and someone from America. Do you know what? We need to be aware of why we believe what we believe, why we feel how we feel. And once we can evaluate that and analyze our own kind of thought processes, we can arrive at a more accurate understanding of what's going on. I would ask to you, Hanney, what's your background, and how do you think that might affect how you evaluate what's going on?
I'm very, very interested in your bias analogy, because this is very important. Because I was thinking about it the other day, and I was thinking, if you take away all biases from all of us, we almost stop being human, and we're almost being elevated to a god status. It's almost impossible. And
Yeah.
even when you think you're doing it, and I'm not even sure if it's even if it's useful or handy. Most of our logical fallacies and biases have actually helped us survive for quite some time. If you didn't love your country and your mother and your family and your tribe, you probably wouldn't survive a day in antiquity. So these biases are well grounded, and they're quite logical, even though that we might say that, well, lots of logical fallacies stem from them. But in the name of practicality, they are needed to give you identity.
Yeah, they might have functional use, but I think they can, unfortunately, also send us down the wrong path in terms of evaluation sometimes. I edited a book years ago called 13 Reasons to Doubt. This is my usual spam section of any video I do. So 13 Reasons to Doubt. And there's a chapter in there by Dr. Caleb Lack about cognitive biases. And he goes through the major ones in great detail, but then says, look, best we can do is be aware of them so we can mitigate against them, but we're never going to rid ourselves of cognitive biases. It's kind of who we are. Like you're saying, it's part of humanity. But it is really, I think, useful in this particular context to be aware, because I think people do jump to conclusions that are sometimes erroneous with regard to the moral evaluation of what is going on here. And that's going to be largely down to who they are, where they've come from. So I think, I look at myself and think, right, am I going to somehow favor Israelis because they are kind of more culturally aligned to my worldview, especially when I'm talking about secular Jews, than maybe Palestinians, but then they're secular Palestinians. Do you know what? I'm trying to make sure that I'm not making these psychological, these evaluative jumps that are somewhat dependent on psychological components of myself.
You're absolutely right, and I think Nietzsche is one of those philosophers that sort of challenge ethics and biases and connected them to aesthetics. So we like to preserve what's beautiful, and we're happy to step on a cockroach because we think it's ugly, but in reality it's a living being, and it has all the right to exist just like we do, but we deem it to be ugly and therefore not worthy of our affection. And it's the same thing for the teams we vouch for. So it'd be, the other team is, these are inhuman, they're doing all these sort of atrocities, and these people look like me, they like to party, they like a pint, and therefore they're similar to me, and therefore I'm going to give them my vote. So I do try to do that, and you'll be quite surprised that the Middle Eastern religious debate is divided, especially the atheist community in the Middle East is divided. Some are with Israel, just on the back of them hating Islam and their background and how it made them feel, and therefore they just straight away they're going with the Western society, and they're going, well, you know what? Everything we hated stemmed from Islam and from the Middle Eastern culture, so we are going to blindly go for everything the West stand for, regardless, as a package, and that actually disturbs me quite a bit, and the other way around.
That's fascinating, because, and this is why I'm partly why I've been looking forward to talking to you, because I like talking to you, Hanney, but also because you have that finger on a pulse that not many people do, which is you speak Arabic, you are you're half Egyptian, am I right, half Irish, so you have a window into a very niche demographic, which is secular people, atheists in the Middle East, who, as you say, are split because of biases that they have. I think that's fascinating insight. Thanks for that.
That's all right. So do you want to start with the I mean, that character Yahweh has done a lot of damage throughout the ages, but what do you think of the stance of choosing certain people? And I'm not sure what the criteria was. Choosing the people and then give them a holy gift in terms of land, even though there are other people were living there. Is that logical? Is that possible?
So it's about understanding these things etiologically. Etiologically means a way of explaining stuff via a story, usually after the fact, right? So, whether it be the pillar of salt, Lot's Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's a big rock, a salty rock that, can be explained by a story that, Lot's wife has turned into a pillar of salt. Okay, that explains that, and why Dead Sea might be salty, blah, blah, blah. You get this quite a lot. So what often happens as well is I think people try and validate themselves ultimately, like as in through the most ultimate thing, which is a god, and more ultimate than a god out of many gods is like, or one god, it's some kind of monotheistic god. So if you could say that, I'll tell you what, we're right. And do you know why do you know why I know we're right? Because it's written in this holy book that God has said. So like all our moral rules, they're not just coming from me. I just haven't made these up. These have come from God, and it's a way of codifying your own people's beliefs and identity and moral laws and whatnot. And then when you say, well, here's a bunch of land, oh, by the way, it's been promised to us by God, it's like, well, you can't argue with that because God, it's written in the Bible because God said it. No one can argue with that. Of course, you kind of need to believe in that God, and that's where we get into a bit of a problem here. But it is a great way to say that we're right because God says we're right, and this is our land because God says it's our land. End of
Yeah.
conversation.
So you think it's sort of the ultimate rubber stamp. So when you have a dispute over a piece of land or something, somebody turns up with a document and says, look at this, it's stamped and authorized by the municipality or the council or whatever. And we've got people here said, I've got a stamp for you. I've got the stamp of approval, and that's the God of the universe has given me this particular land.
And you and I, we're atheists, right? So we don't believe that God actually came down and promised that. So we necessarily have to believe that's how it came about. Like there is no way. It's not like, oh, he didn't quite say that. He said something else. No, he didn't exist, right? So there was never this moment where God got together with Moses or whoever or Abraham and said X, Y, and Z, right? So we don't believe that. But likewise, now it's interesting because you've got Abrahamic faith, so you've got Islam, and you can tell me exactly what Muslims believe about a promised covenant to the Jews, because I'm not aware of that. I'd be really interested in what you have to say. But you potentially got Muslims, Christians, and Jews all adhering to that general idea that there's a covenant with God with those people because of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Torah, first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. So. But outside of those believers, like everyone else in the world, is like, well, that never happened. So God's not promised that to you because we don't believe in that God. And then you get some Christians saying, well, we believe in that God, but actually the Old Testament is not that important. So it's a bit, and they could leave that behind. So what's the situation with where Muslims stand with regard to this covenant?
So it's very interesting. Israel, or the God of Israel, and Moses in particular, occupy a significant part of the Quran. Yeah. They actually speak about the Israelites probably more than Muhammad and Islam in the Quran, because it gives a strong foundation. See, every religion, when it comes anew, it needs a strong foundation. And if you coming to present yourself as the same God of your ancestors, then there is a big a part of that story. It's not emphasized. Yes, the promised land is mentioned there, but it was mentioned as a contemporary concept around that time. It's not promised forever.
Right.
Yeah, and especially if you put as well the understanding, people need to understand something. What we see today in terms of I'm British. I like bangers and mash, a pint, the pub, God Save the Queen, Manchester United, all of or the King now. Yeah, correct. The King now. All of these things were not readily available. The understanding of a land or a country, it was quite vague back in antiquity. So claiming land and other nations claiming land and you being sort of, most people were nomadic, traveling to find their the food for the day. So today's concept about borders, exact borders, and this is where you live and this is where you belong, was quite blurred. So it was very easy sort of to adopt that, and there are sort of people that would actually belong to different races or different nations and sort of traveled around. So that sentiment wasn't very, very strong at that time, but and it was actually up to the 18th century was the case. You had maybe 2 or 3 empires that sort of controlled the world, and
But yeah, I was just wondering. So, I mean, they believed in like Ibrahim, and Ishmael and all these figures. So
Yes.
there must have been some agreement that God did have an understanding that God did have an agreement with these people. But is it that these people are now not Jews? They're Muslims that agreement. Do you know what I mean? Does that
It's
morph into
correct, superseded, because the only religion for God in Islam is Islam. It's
yeah?
always been Islam. These were the sort of the preparation for God's true religion, you know, and therefore, according to Muslims, Abraham and Moses, Jesus were all Muslims. You know,
So then we get to, so this is a problem of pluralism. So you have Muslims effectively saying, right, well, we've got divine decree to being the chosen people, and you've got Jews saying, well, we've got divine decree to being the chosen people and having access or having ownership over this land. And then you're at loggerheads here because two peoples are claiming access to this land or ownership over this land. Now, in my Israel-Palestine videos, I started off with biases, which we've gone through, and I also start talking about borders, which you've hinted at. So it's important to understand that borders are arbitrary. They're accidents of history and geography. They don't exist out there, they exist in here. And they, even if we write them on a map, it's only by consensus. So, for example, only in this last year, you've had China redrawing the map, their own map, to include a small area of Russia in the east and a small area of India, I believe. And who's right? Of course, no one's right or wrong. Maps are just consensus agreements, and they can change. And you look at the European history, you look at European history and the borders in the different nations in Europe, and you see it change hugely over time as countries come and go as actual entities, and countries are only agreed on by the principle of consensus, either internally and or externally with other players, and so there isn't some kind of objective truth to how the world works in terms of borders. In fact, we've only had nation states relatively recently. Before we had city states, and we self-subsistent nomadic farmers or peoples, and so on and so forth. So there's no kind of truth to how the world should be. The world is how it is, and we kind of try and make sense of it, and hopefully we make rules, and if we can all agree on those rules, then it's great, and then we can try and have a rules-based order, which we can come and talk about later, because that's really important for how these two factions of people exist. But I think it's important to understand that there aren't borders that exist out there. They exist in here. So therefore, we have to agree on the borders ourselves.
Spot on, Jonathan. And to give people some example, in the Middle East, if you go to geography lesson in a school in Egypt, the map of Israel will read Palestine. The body of sea between Saudi Arabia and Iran, in Iran is called the Persian Gulf. In Saudi Arabia, it's called the Arabian Gulf. So this is how it works.
Yeah, and that it means an area of land means something to whoever is doing the conceiving. This is why I'm a conceptual nominalist. So conceptual nominalist states that abstract ideas don't exist apart from in the minds of the conceiver. So in order for me to conceive, the concept exists as I conceive it. But I can look at something a bit like Immanuel Kant would say, you can't know a thing in itself. You just have some kind of subjective interpretation of the thing, Ding and sich. And you will look at the same thing and have a different interpretation. And that will be the same with how we look at history and how we look at geography. And you will interpret things in a different way that I do. Or we might align ourselves and just agree, and that's the consensus. And things are great when we have consensus because we all agree on stuff, but we don't always have consensus, and hence the Middle East.
So we're talking about the phenomena, and the phenomena is always going to be concealed. I don't think there's a phenomena in the first place. I think everything is a phenomena because things cease to have any sort of meaning in the absence of a conscious mind conceiving of them. They're there physically.
That's what. Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah.
So there are things with properties, but even those properties are conceived by us.
Yeah.
So yes, yeah.
Yeah, and therefore, I mean, and that's one of the questions about the existence of God, because if God is one of those abstract ideas, the only way that abstract idea can turn from nomina to a phenomena is through a conscious mind. So you create a conscious mind to be able to be conceived. Otherwise, you're just nothing.
Agreed. Yeah, yeah, and also the fact that, I mean, this is kind of goes on to the position of agnosticism. Like, none of us, we're all kind of trying to get our heads around what God is, and none of us kind of know or can access, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's a whole
Yeah.
other discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is so from the Hebrews point of view, there's a covenant. God. But can you, in through your readings and studies of the Hebrew Bible and the philosophy is of the Israelites, what was the criteria, that or what were the criteria that God used um, to to predicate and to anchor his decision that these people worthy of my choice? Was there anything in particularly special about the
As in,
Hebrews?
what were their? How did they deserve to
Yeah.
be those people to be chosen? Really good question. I mean, again, the reality of it is that they were the people, placing that chosenness onto themselves. Like I was saying earlier, this is, so whatever it is, it's going to be from their point of view to showing how deserving they are because of the fathers, the early uh, biblical figures, your Abrahams and going back to Cain and Abel, and it's all the stories that come down that get rubber stamped by God, and that's how rubber stamped by yourself with the rubber stamp of God, as you're kind of self-validating all the way through those stories. So in reality, there is nothing that they've done to deserve this. They are just those people that get to write their own history. I mean, I'm very close to just going off on one here because you can talk about the history of how the Bible was written, and then you get into the long weeds of like when it was written. So the traditional Jewish and Christian understanding is that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
but then it includes his own death, so that's a bit weird. Then more critical scholarship came along, and I think that I would go with the prevailing modern scholarship that actually was written in the exilic period. So the Jewish people were exiled into Babylon or Babylonia. Not all of them, but a lot of them were exiled, and they were without a history book, if you like, a sense of national identity, and they were exiled and they needed that national identity. So they end up writing the Bible or the Hebrew Bible, and then kind of backdating it, if you like. And it was this just kind of expression of who they were. But it was relatively late, and none of these things happened. They nicked a bunch of stories from their exiled communities. We saw Sargon II of Akkad having the birth narrative that's exactly the same as Moses's, so they write that into Moses, so on and so forth. And you get this storybook that's written that places these people in that geographical area, and then says, and God promised us this land, we are the chosen people. But of course, they're not. It only becomes more prevalent as they establish themselves as a more united people in that area over time, up until the Christian period. But even then, they weren't hugely united. And you can start again, I'm going to go off on one, but you can look at the Elephantine papyri, which are sort of from the 500s BC, I think, 600s, maybe 500s, and these are documents that show that actually Jewish people didn't even have an Orthodox Judaism. So they had almost a syncretism where they'd taken aspects of other religions, and it was almost polytheistic. And these are letters, these are papyri that we can see where they're like, hang on, they don't mention a single biblical figure that you would know about, like your Moseses and Abrahams and all this.
Mm-hmm.
So none of the big biblical figures are mentioned. And you're thinking, okay, this then feeds into, because this is like really old stuff, but it's not nearly as old as what the traditionalists claim the Bible was written in that time. But modern scholarship says the Bible was written late in the exilic period. After that, the Elephantine papyri. So it looks like those figures and those stories didn't exist until really quite late, the exilic period, and then it was all made up. And here we are. And then we have people nowadays, thousands of years later, saying, well, this is our homeland, this is promised to us by God. And like, actually, if we go back and start trying to understand the history there, we can pick that apart really quite easily. I know, sorry, I'm butchering loads of stuff there because I'm trying to go off on lots of tangents, but trying to bring it all together to say, look, this promise never happened. You and I say it never happened, but even if you want to think it happens, let's look at beyond the fact of whether God exists or not. Let's look at the history. Let's delve into the archaeology. Let's look at these papyri. Let's look at our understanding of how the Bible is constructed. It didn't happen. There's no way that it happened like it was claimed. Now, where does that leave the Jewish people? Well, they can only convince themselves of that. They're not going to convince other people outside of the Jewish communities that they have some divine right to that land.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's where it's going.
No, I completely agree. I'm going to ask you a question now in a second. Do you think, we know from modern psychology, and it's been portrayed in art and film and so forth, that an individual, when suppressed, especially a child, they can end up creating an alter ego, a hero, or a person that will end up saving them. We see it in some horror movies, like the Exorcism of Emily Rose, where the girl was sort of sexually assaulted by a close relative, and she became sort of possessed, or a child creating an alter ego of a superhero if somebody is trying to save him. Do you think that can happen on a nation level, where a group of people that get suppressed so much that they end up creating a super entity that saves their bacon?
Well, I don't know if you mean a divine entity, but they did.
Yeah.
You could argue that was what Moses was. So they were in exile in Babylonia, like enslaved, if you like, but not quite enslaved, but in exile. And they create the story of Moses releasing them from bondage in a foreign land and leading them to their promised land, right? So that is a sense of what you were saying there, possibly.
I'm suggesting even the creation of Yahweh. Yahweh is the adopting God. He's the storm desert God who's actually wasn't even large. He was like one of the offspring of El, the chief god, and suddenly that was created to become, and it's a warrior god. It's not any type of god. It's a god that can actually win you wars.
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, they'll be looking at all the gods around them. I mean, it kind of became a monolatry before it became a monotheism. So it was like a supreme god amongst a number of gods, Yahweh, and then that sort of morphed into, okay, there's only one god, and then all the elements of these other gods then got subsumed into Yahweh as well. So you find stories of Baal and other gods becoming stories of Yahweh, and so on and so forth. And eventually, you have a group of people that then it becomes more orthodox and uniform in the area, and then everyone starts believing the same sort of thing. But then, history does funny things, right? And it changes places over time. And so Jews then in the area ended up moving largely out of the area to diaspora communities. You had other peoples moving in. Even in the early times we've just been talking about, you had Philistines and you had Phoenicians, you had all sorts of different people around there. So there wasn't really any kind of unity. Jews were a part of that. And then that goes on for 2,000 years. So eventually you get the Ottoman Empire in the sort of 1400s, starting to make use of that land, if you like. Not initially. I think it was originally the Ottoman Empire was Greece and Turkey, and then moving into Europe, and then it came down into the Levant and down into North Africa and Saudi Arabia sort of areas, and that progressed until your 1900s. So you had different people living in these places with different belief systems, and no one's got a claim to the land. People, you look at it's interesting. You could talk about how Native American Indians, having just gone and seen Killers of the Flower Moon last night, a 3.5-hour marathon of a movie. But that's a film about Native American Indians. Now, do they have a right to that land? Can they go back to the Americans who live there now and say, actually, this is our land? And these are the arguments that exist around there. But to look at maybe the Jewish position, you could say, well, actually, arguably, they could just go and maybe have a right to that land. But although you could, they wouldn't argue it comes from God necessarily. And so it's very difficult to say that peoples from times past have a particular right to a land after history has passed and people have moved and you've got different generations and different humans. It's just we try and make the best of really tricky situations.
I just was trying to say it wasn't a big deal. So if a group of people say God has given me that land, they go, okay. It wasn't as important back then. And I want to point out that the Philistines mentioned in the Old Testament, because the word of Palestine in Arabic is Palestine. So it's always been conflated with the word Philistines, that these are the current Palestinians, which is incorrect. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Philistines were like a sort of Greek type of people.
Yeah, that's how I understood it. Yeah.
Yeah. So because they're saying, oh, look at this, Palestine existed at the time. So I needed to be unbiased and explain that this is not the Palestinian of today.
My point to like X existed then is always, so what? Like
exactly.
I don't mean to be like dismissive, because that will probably piss off both Palestinians and Israelis here, because my point is that, well, that's history, this is now, and we are humans and we need to live together. I live here, you live here, shouldn't we live together in harmony? That's the really simple kind of like simplistic understanding. But it's like, you know, England is from the Angles, the Anglo-Saxons, that come, you know, Saxony and Angles, and then we got the Danes, and then we got Vikings, and they all come. You know, I could go back 2,000 years and say, well, look what it was at this point. But all I'm doing is cherry picking a particular time, because 1,000 years in front of that, or 1,000 years before that, I've got different people living there doing different things. So, like, whenever you say, you know, this used to be, at point X, this used to belong to people's A, then you're like, well, why choose point X? So don't cherry pick your time. And in fact, so what about the time? Unless it's like really recent past, in which case it's kind of affecting now and things in our lifetimes. You know, we need to just get on and find solutions that involve human beings living together in harmony. And that sounds all la-di-da, but that's the reality of what we all want, right?
Agreed. So let's move a little bit forward in history, because the Zionism, and it's a word now that has a very bad reputation. Even some Jews trying to alienate themselves from the term and say we're Jewish but we're not Zionists. And you have them in England. You know, you've got. I was actually in London a few weeks ago, and I went to a place near Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, and it was full of Jews. The streets were just full of Jews, and these were some Hasidic and Orthodox Jews, even in New York, will have a demonstration arguing for Palestine and the Palestinians' right to live, and actually angry about the conduct at the moment of Israel, and they're not Zionists. This was a secular movement. These people were not actual. I mean, deep down, I think about more probably than 80% of all Jews are kind of secular. They don't believe of anything. Oh, what do you think happened there at that sort of political turn point where they said, okay, we need to have a nation for the Jewish people, but they used a religious promise, even though they weren't really believing in it?
The way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm no expert, but the way I understand it is that those kind of Torah believing Zionists, or like non-Zionists, Torah believing Jews who are very, I guess, orthodox and fundamentalist in their belief, that are pro-Palestinian or anti that kind of Zionism, are doing so from a religious point of view, which is to say that it's not up to humans to go and re-establish this land. as a homeland. It's up to God to do that, and we're waiting for God to do that.
Correct.
And you guys have done that as humans, and therefore you can call it Israel, but it's not really Israel, because it's not like divinely sanctioned. So that's how I understand what they've done. But I could be wrong. I mean, the growth of Zionism started in the 1800s as a result of anti-Semitism that was growing with, you know, philosophies and politics in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. But of course, obviously, you got Germany as well in the Second World War. A manifestation of that eventually. But you have this growing anti-Semitism, and people, I think Berlin became a center of Zionist thought, where Jewish diaspora communities are like, we don't like this oppression. Why don't we go and find literally a safe space, a safe land, our homeland? And, you know, it has that kind of chimes in with your religious beliefs, but it's also a pragmatic kind of political solution to the anti-Semitism that they're experiencing. So there was that, and that movement started growing from the sort of 1800s, late 1800s through the early 1900s. All the while, you had the Ottoman Empire that was still in charge of, or you know, had under its wings that whole region. But the Ottoman Empire was this unhappy marriage between the Turks and the Arabs. And you started at the time, in the early 1900s, you started having a growth in Arab nationalism and Turkish nationalism. And those two ideals, those two worlds didn't really jive well together. So there was a potential schism in the Ottoman Empire. And then the Ottoman Empire went on the side of the Germans in World War II. Mm-hmm. And then the British, who were kind of around at the time, they were fighting over, obviously, in Europe, and it wasn't going great. It was really challenging. But they're also around the Suez Canal and thinking, hang on, we could use this kind of Arab nationalism and Turkish nationalism to drive a schism between the two groups within the Ottoman Empire. And since they're on the side of the Germans, this could help us over here in this neck of the woods. And let's do that. So then they started doing some sort of quiet dealings with Arab nationalists, particularly a chap called Sharif Hussein,
yes,
who was a really, you know, big name, and started sort of promising an Arab state of self-determination. And that was one thing that was going on. So the Arabs are like thinking, oh, this is cool. We might get a state of self-determination and an Arab state. This is brilliant. And all the while, this growing Zionism was taking place, and you had some diaspora Jews coming back and resettling in the area, like actually from the late 1800s onwards. But then during the Second World War, you had Russia against Germany as well. And then the British got some intelligence to suggest that the Bolshevik party and the Bolshevik movement, there were important Jews in there. And there's one guy called Chaim Weizmann, who was a prominent Russian biochemist Jew, who then they started sort of talking with and doing deals with, because that would keep the Russians in place, which would mean the German resources were diverted. So they're starting to say to Weizmann and people, oh yeah, right, Zionism, you want some kind of Jewish homeland. Yeah, we can help you out of that. So the British basically were doing deals with both sides and promising them both things that were completely inconsistent with each other.
They played God for a while.
yeah. It was pure imperialism. Well, but because while all that was going on, the British were getting together with the French, and they came up with something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Yeah.
And the Sykes-Picot Agreement was like, we're going to carve up this whole area after the First World War between the French in the north and the British in the south. And we will have Palestine as an international area. That was the original agreement. So they were promising stuff to the Arabs, promising stuff to the Jews, and then meanwhile doing a deal with the French to carve up the whole area for themselves. So because the British wanted the British mandate with Iraq because it had oil. So they wanted like the Persian area. The French were more interested in Syria, had connections there.
Yeah.
So the whole thing was a mess of largely of British making, and it didn't help that you had the Balfour Declaration. So we had a foreign minister at the time, who was previously the Prime Minister,
Balfour.
James Arthur Balfour, and he came up with the Balfour Declaration. I wonder if I have that in my notes as to exactly what the text was for the Balfour Declaration, because actually it's so important, because it underwrites all the problems you've got there now. I'm going to Google that. So you carry on giving your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very true in terms of history. This is a very dicey and very problematic period where multiple countries were promised different things, and the English had a very big stake in the whole thing. And we have to mention as well that the Jews weren't completely foreign to the to that territory. There are coins dated back from the 1890 that has the Arabic, Hebrew, and English word on coins. So the Jews were living there prior.
So I think so. The Jews took up at the time about, I think it was 8% of the population. There were 700,000 Palestinians. They had a minority population for sure, but you also started to get Jewish diaspora communities, having people come back from those communities to Israel, and you also had this situation where these people coming back are actually also largely organizations of these people. Like, there were two particular funds that were buying up land. It wasn't so much that they were settling by taking land, but they're actually buying up large amounts of land. Mm-hmm. And that complicates things because there's a voluntary exchange there. So people are selling them land. But I was thinking about this earlier today, thinking about how would I feel if, like, Shell or Monsanto or ExxonMobil was like going up and bona fide buying land off people, offering them good money for land. And then, that was going on. And then, like, 20 years later, like 50% of my community was suddenly bought up by Shell. I'd be like, I'm not too cool with that. Do you know what I mean? Now, I know that's a limited analogy, but the point is you can have a voluntary arrangement that can still not fit well with the people living there after a certain amount of time and a certain amount of land has been sold.
Yeah, but you'd argue as well. Would you argue as well is people have had to protect their own interests. So from the point of view of the individual who's selling his house for a good amount of money, they're not wary of whether this has been orchestrated or organized movement by the Jews to be able to do that in the to ensure that they have a certain stakehold in that territory, and might have been even spontaneous. We don't even know whether it's been planned or organized. Obviously, after the event, you can come up with all type of theories, but what we know is, yes, some land was exchanged for money, but the Balfour Declaration is the one that I think has broke the camel's back.
Yeah, so if I can just share with
please,
people the Balfour Declaration. Let's say this is a text of the Balfour Declaration. I don't know if you can add that in. I know it's a bit small. So no, I can't. So anyway, dear Lord Rothschild, I had the pleasure to convey you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. So before you get into the words, and the next 67 words after that are the Balfour Declaration, right? But before you get into that, you have an understanding that the British here are in sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, and therefore not kind of as sympathetic to the Palestinians who are living there. So this is the declaration. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment of Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. Sounds pretty clear there. But it then says this, and the problem is, I think these two things are just contradictory. It then says, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, I don't think those two things go particularly well together. You can take that down if you want now. But I don't think those two things go particularly well together. It's also interesting that that Balfour Declaration kind of got written into the Versailles peace agreements after the First World War that then allowed the area to be carved up between basically the British and the French, with the Russians having involvement, the Italians as well. The nature is you've just got a massive hot mess where the British are promising to the Arabs and they're promising to Jewish people as well, and also set out this declaration that seems overtly pro-Jewish, but also states that actually it shouldn't affect the Palestinians negatively, but it doesn't quite work like that. So, what are your thoughts on the Balfour Declaration?
Oh well, I think it's very pragmatic, and again, you can criticize it from an ethical point of view. But then this is a different world we're talking about. We're different context and nations and countries. We said that everything was blurred. We've talking about other empires have done similar things in the past. I know the British maybe didn't do the right thing ethically, if you want to sort of judge them that way. But then there's so many stories in history where even worse that happened by the strong ones. This is a story, unfortunately, and I'm so sadly to say that we're not going to see the ass of. This is going to happen over and over and over again. It might take different forms. It might be a little bit masked and subdued because of the 21st century cancel culture, and you'll have to show a different face on what you're doing in the background. But back then, the world was quite blatant and obvious. What you see is what you get, which is kind of refreshing now in terms of what's happening right now, because you have world leaders will turn up on international stages saying something, and in the background something completely different is being cooked, and you see the result of. So that's even worse.
Yeah, I mean, my goodness, it's a right hot mess. I mean, we could fast forward right to the UN resolution for a truce last night, where this is. So if I can share this, I don't know if that's okay. Share this tab instead. Sure. Can you just put that up? So just to give an understanding of how difficult this is, if you look at, so this was for a truce, ceasefire, humanitarian arrangement last night at the UN. And as far as I can work out here, the European nations are split between in favour, against, and abstention, which means that the Europeans who have got together, the EU have got together and say, right, let's have a united front in terms of the Gaza, Israel. And then when it comes to voting, everyone votes all over the place because it's so freaking complicated. It's because they have sympathies in all sorts of different areas, and you've got your own diaspora communities of both Jews and you could even argue like Muslims, because it seems that this is dividing along religious lines as well. So you can take that down if you want. I just thought that was interesting. I mean, what you had after the First World War is that the area was carved up, and then you had Jews continuing to move into the area, buying up land and immigrating into the Palestinian landmass. And then you have eventually in 1948, kind of British give up their mandate and say, right, you can go yourselves. And you had the creation of the State of Israel. And you had Chaim Weizmann again, who was, I think, the first leader of the Israeli state. Well, before that, you had the Palestinians saying, hey, we don't really like all this unrestricted immigration of Jews into our area. And the British were cognizant of that. So then they restricted the immigration. But then, so you had basically Palestinian terrorism back in the sort of 20s, 30s going on. And then you had restriction of the immigration, and you had Israeli terrorism. And it's just like a big hot mess already then, it appears to me. And then the State of Israel was created. But of course, what about the Palestinians who lived there? What about the ownership of the land there? And then you have going forward, the 6 Day War. You have all these different. You had the Intifadas where there were like big old riots and whatnot, and over this time, the Israelis, because they had a better kind of a war machine, I guess. They were able to establish themselves more robustly, and then the Palestinians got pushed into certain areas and had less and less land, even though the populations, should have dictated it might be otherwise, so on and so forth. And then I'm just fast forwarding through like 70 years now.
Yeah.
To modern times.
But John, this list is quite interesting. Some names there, especially in the abstention, you can see Iraq and Tunisia abstained from voting, which is incredible.
That is interesting. Actually, I hadn't noticed Iraq there.
Two Arab countries, and especially Iraq. That's like in the midst of it.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Very bizarre, and yeah.
I think this is a really good synopsis of where they were at. And this is going back to sort of the 1920s. Avi Shlaim, who's professor of international relations at Oxford, saw it in this way, quote, "The Arabs had a strong case, but very poor advocates. The Zionists had a case. It wasn't as strong as the local Arabs, but they had brilliant advocates. Zionism is one of the greatest public success stories of the 20th century. Chaim Weizmann exemplified these traditional Jewish skills of advocacy and persuasion." In other words, like, the Jews didn't have a good case for the state of Israel and for the land there to the British and international players, but they were much better at kind of advocacy, diplomacy, and persuasion.
And still.
And you could argue that's still the case. And again, you could talk about biases. So did the Jewish population, or did people like Weizmann have that purchase with the British, for example, because he was Jewish, more kind of European of origin, and rather than dealing with these Arab people who would have been in the out group for the British much more than, say, Weizmann would have been. So yeah, they could be better advocates and better persuaders, but also these guys are a bit more like me, so I'm more likely, and this is where psychology comes into it maybe as well. That's me speculating.
Yeah. Look, even the Jews have been persecuted throughout sort of the history for being different, for committing deicide. They killed God after all, So they have not been sort of very popular. However, and I've got to call a spade, they've contributed a little bit more than the Arabs to humanity in terms of sciences. They had brilliant people working on sciences, working on arts, working on philosophy, working on different endeavor. And I think, again, adversity can create an interesting persona on individual and nationalistic level. And I think a nation that struggles and goes through all these atrocities, they tend to be resilient, and maybe smarter and wiser. The Arabs, on the other hand, being a bit more nomadic, they've been sort of obscure and protected from the rest of the world. They were quite naive. They didn't have the experience on the world stage and how to portray their ideas and how to convince people. It's still happening today. If I'm on the fence, and I get a Palestinian and Israeli, the Israeli will make a compelling argument, even though their stance is quite weak, but using the right words, trying to appeal to my psychological state of mind, while the Palestinian will straight away tell you that you're stupid and you're unethical, and if you choose anything else, then you're nothing less than an animal. And I go, shit, I'm being sweet talked here by the Jew, and I'm leaning towards that sort of narrative rather than somebody is shouting and frothing in the mouth, and that has always been detrimental to the Arabic cause.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation there, and it goes back to what the quote was about. So I tend to agree. Not that I have met an awful lot of either, actually. So going from there, you have, historically speaking, you've got the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, you've got the first Intifada, which was this kind of rebellion, so Palestinian uprising. There's one in 1987, led to clashes, protests, and violence against Israeli occupation in West Bank and Gaza and Israel. And in each of these times, the kind of pushback to this led to the Palestinians having less and less. Which then fuels their anger more and more, and it becomes this cycle of feeling of oppression and so on and so forth. It's definitely difficult for them. There was something else I was going to say. It will come back to me. But yeah, that was it. And one of the challenges for Palestinians is that in all these agreements, Palestine ended up being a non-contiguous entity. In other words, it's not joined. You've got the West Bank and you've got Gaza. The Gaza Strip has become, 25 square miles, the third most densely populated area in the world. Some saying it's the most. So it's just basically an urban area. And then you've got West Bank over here, and it's not joined. Like, what a disadvantage for a nation to not, or supposedly a nation to not have contiguous land masses like that, which that means that Israel gets to control that movement between the two. Then you've got West Bank as an area on the West Bank of the Jordan that is then settled into more and more by Jewish people over time, and then obviously that's upsetting the Palestinians, and it goes along to sort of 2006, is it? Yeah, 2006, where you have elections, Palestinian elections. And over this time, previously, so over this time, PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which originally was like a terrorist organization, and morphed into actually the official umbrella of Palestinian politics, out of which you have parties like Fatah, who are much more officially recognized as a political party, as opposed to Hamas, which is recognized as a terrorist organization by most people. You have 2006 comes along, and then there are these elections. And although Fatah win a presidential election, they don't win the legislative elections, particularly in Gaza. So Fatah, basically, the PLO control West Bank, as far as I understand it, and Gaza Strip becomes controlled by Hamas. Now, here's a really key point, mate, and that is that people talk about, but Hamas, that's who they voted in, and blah, 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 blah. But actually, Hamas don't have a mandate, because there hasn't been an election there for 17 years, which means that no one under the age of 35 has voted for elections in the Gaza Strip, which means that and then there was maybe 75% turnout, which is pretty good, but you got 25% of people didn't vote. So that means that if we're looking at all the people in Gaza Strip, how many of those people voted in 2006 for Hamas? And actually relatively few. They don't have a mandate to rule that area. They're ruling by effectively terroristic dictatorship, if you like, although a lot of people there might align themselves with Hamas. And here's the key point. So not only do Hamas not have mandate, but key point is the subset fallacy, I like to call it. It's probably got an official name. I call it subset fallacy. All cats are animals, but not all animals are cats. All Hamas are Palestinians, give or take, let's assume. All Hamas are Palestinians, but not all Palestinians are Hamas. So if you are going to take things out on Gaza Strip, you are going to be killing people who are not Hamas. You can't tar all Palestinians with the Hamas brush. But all Hamas are Palestinians, so you've got to understand that there's a difference there. In the same way that all of the Israeli government are Israeli people, but not all Israeli people support the Israeli government. So the actions of people like Netanyahu and Smotrich, or Shotrich, is it, who are real right wingers doing things to Gaza Strip, might not be to the taste of all of the Israelis. And so it's very easy to tar. I've seen people who are pro-Palestine say, like, you can't tar Hamas with the same brush, and then go F Israel, F Israel, like tar the entirety of Israel with the brush of the decisions of Netanyahu. And it's like, hang on, mate, you've just been a massive hypocrite here. We need to be really careful that you've got a spectrum of people in Israel and a spectrum of Palestinians as well.
Oh, this is nothing new under the sun, Jonathan. This has always been the case. It's the poor civilians are always going to be the victims of this. This is what is sad for me in the 21st century. And in the words of Christopher Hitchens, we're still evolving. Our adrenaline gland is way too big, and our prefrontal lobe cortex is still small. We're still apish in the way we handle things, and I think this is going to be going for a while. It's sad, but and I'm going to ask you an ethical question here. We're going to go to a bit of philosophy and ask an ethical question. With the pyramid of needs, and having ethics and having morality and having good and evil, everything is at stake at the very top of that pyramid. When your life is threatened, so your biological being, that which ethics is predicated upon, would then ethics and morality and issues of morality get suspended until you preserve life, and then you can start engaging in immorality?
100%. Yeah, completely agree with that. I'm going to rewind a little bit because let's just go back a couple of weeks, right? So Hamas went and did some absolutely, truly despicable things. I've seen videos, mate. I've seen videos of things that Hamas did that I can't unsee. I've seen some of I have seen the most disgusting things I've ever seen in my life. Right. So what Hamas did, and many Israelis will know this, was so truly disgusting that the Israelis couldn't react in any way but absolute horror, and therefore want revenge. So this becomes about revenge and retribution as much as kind of self-defense. And we need to understand that. And so when people are so anxious and angry, their ability to rationalize goes out, and their head fills up with anger. And as it fills up with anger, rationality is squeezed out, right? And so Israelis won't be in a position to do like the most level-headed rationalizations after what Hamas did. It was truly horrible. But then you're met with a problem. So the Israelis were met with a huge problem, which is like, we need to react to this. We need to react strongly to this. But Hamas are also basically back in Gaza Strip amongst civilians. So the only way we can react strongly to this is to basically bomb them. If we send our troops in, you go into urban warfare, we're going to lose a lot of troops, and that makes it worse for us. We don't want to do that. But the good thing about going in with troops on the ground is that you can differentiate more easily, although that itself is massively difficult, between who's Hamas and who's not. It's very difficult because anyone can have a gun, and they're not dressed with signs going, "Hey, I'm Hamas." So, so therefore, we don't want to send the troops in. That's going to be too dangerous for us. So we need to hit people from a distance. But the problem is you are going to have collateral damage. So you then start having these calculations, and this is where it starts getting onto morality, which is like, okay, is it worth us killing? And I'm putting numbers out in my posterior here, but is it worth us killing 300 civilians if we get 5 Hamas targets of this particular level? So is that 300 to 5 a moral calculation that's worth it for us? And they will be kind of making these decisions on the basis of some kind of moral consequentialism like that as a means to an end. It's like, we can't get away without killing civilians here, and we need to react strongly, because if we don't react strongly, then that's allowing Hamas to do what they like, and we have to. So they're in a real bind here. And it's a moral dilemma. And the other thing, sorry, I know I talked a lot. The other thing is what is some people call the Hamas trap, which is that Hamas came in and did those terrible things. Now, Hamas would have known that Israel were going to do terrible things back to the population back in Gaza, right? Now, Hamas did that anyway, which means that either they wanted Israel to do terrible things to their population because it then gets their population right on Hamas's side, and they're basically using that population sacrificially as a means to an end, or they didn't mind that Israel did that. It was worth it. Either way, they've got almost a lack of not respect, a lack of value for their own population, because they're going and doing these terrible things in Israel and then running back, and Israel, and they know Israel are going to hit them hard and they'll lose a lot of Palestinians. So that's a Palestinian trap, because either way, whatever Israel do, they're going to absolutely piss off people who are aligned with Palestine. They're going to piss off Muslim communities around the world, which has happened, and it's all gone mental. So Hamas have got what they want. Israel have got really no choice in the matter, and it's the Hamas trap, I think. And then we get onto these moral calculations. Sorry,
Yeah.
and now, sorry, I haven't answered your question, but
No, that's all right. And I think we might have to end up doing a second part, because I think this
so.
is way too complex. But I want to end with this thought.
Can you re-ask me that question? Because I did want to answer it. What was your question?
I kind of forgotten now. But it will come to me. But it was the ethical repercussions of somebody who's trying to preserve life. So if you're trying to preserve your life, would morality then exist?
Totally agree with you. So what happens is, so for those who don't know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a pyramid. It wasn't a pyramid when he originally wrote it, but it became this pyramid where you have self-actualization at the top. You have these different levels that are built on top of the other. Now, some people debate it's exactly what he meant, but let's just go with the most simplistic understanding that once you've got your physiological needs, your kind of food, water, health, safety, warmth, you can move up to the next level and you worry about that, and then the next level. And once you put these levels in place, you can then get to self-actualization. And I could agree with this. And sort of a good example is like when in economic recessions, so before economic recessions where people have got disposable income, you're doing you're buying ethically. You're being an ethical consumer. Some people are, I've got extra money, I'm going to buy fair trade and I'm going to buy environmentally sustainable stuff. It costs me more, but it's fine. And then as soon as the economic recession comes along and your money's cut in half, you're like, right, sod that, I'm buying the cheapest stuff I can. And so morality goes out the window until other things are in place. So I absolutely agree with that. And I think for people like the Palestinians, the problem is whatever Israel do, they're going to force more Palestinians into the arms of Hamas. And the people will be fighting for their lives, and you'll be seeing the enemy, and morality goes out the window. But the same for the Israelis, which is they feel threatened. And so you kind of lash out to try and completely eliminate the threat. But in eliminating the threat, unfortunately, you're eliminating all sorts of other people, civilians, who then become the threat. So it's like you're shooting yourself in the foot. It's just that is the hot mess.
So the thing that I want to end up with, so we are caught in a vicious cycle, of retribution, and I like what Egypt did. And one of my favorite presidents is President Sadat. So Egypt was involved in about 4 wars: 1948, 56, 67, and then 73, where they call it the 6th of October victory. So they broke the Bardif line and went a little bit into sort of Israel, had a bit of a brief victory. Then Sadat knows that he cannot win that war because it's the US, it's all of Europe and Israel against unorganized Arabic nations.
So is that the Yom Kippur War where they did that surprise attack? Yeah.
Correct, yeah. The 10th of Ramadan, 6th of October. It's a national day in Egypt at the moment. And then he goes, you know what? I want peace. And I'm going to speak in your Knesset. Let me speak. I'll go to your country and I'll speak. And says, okay, well, how about trade, stability and safety, and long-lasting peace for 2 states? And, because pragmatically he knows he's not going to win this war. And we're talking about the Palestinian affair. But Egypt's got all its land back, so Sinai is back now. And Taba was one of the last of the areas, was retrieved by a court order, completely legal and diplomacy, in 1982. The last piece of Sinai was returned back to Egypt. So you can do it. It can be done, because remember, psychologically, think about this. Israel has one weakness point. They know they are always going to be surrounded by enemies. Imagine having to go to bed not completely comfortable. You'd want to get that monkey off your back. You want these
Yeah.
nations to acknowledge your existence, and you'll probably trade a bit of land to get that peace of mind, because there are generations who are going to come, a child who want to be running freely, not worrying about the future.
Here's one problem for the Israelis there, and this is kind of a military problem, but they had no defense in depth. So Israel is a tiny country. So if you're talking about, say, Ukraine, and there you can look at the Donbass, which is the region on the east of Ukraine, and you can say, right, we can give Russia, I don't mean give like let them have it, but in terms of like a military incursion, right, we can allow them this 100 kilometers there. If we put our defensive line there, that's a better place to have a defensive line, and blah, blah, blah. And then that gives us a buffer, and then any missiles won't hit that city. So you got this space to be able to do your kind of military maneuvers. Israel doesn't have that. Israel is like a tiny thin country, and so any attack in Israel is an attack on everywhere, and nowhere's safe. But that probably feeds into a sense of, like you were saying, a sense of like, not only are we completely surrounded, sea on one side, enemies everywhere, but anything they do, any attack from anywhere can hit anywhere. Like, you know, missiles from Gaza can hit Tel Aviv, and for, you know, everywhere is vulnerable. So that probably leads to a really strong sense of paranoia.
Imagine the collapse of the United States at some point. We're talking maybe 50, 100 years from now. And then the European Union is taken over by a younger generation who've developed more of an ethical sort of foundation where this thing doesn't sit right with them. And suddenly Israel is left stranded.
Yeah. I mean, so, you know, that's why they developed the so much, you know, they're big on the industrial military complex and developing weapons so that they can have that advantage, because they lose in terms of population, in terms of, I mean, this is why they conscript women as well. It's
Yes.
they need, and it's actually worked, because they managed to mobilize 300,000 people within a week. Well, that's insanely good, but that's only they're only able to do that because they mobilize women. So it's all these things because they know how weak they really are going forward, and they rely on a lot of international support.
But on the other hand, Jonathan, the Arabs also need to understand this is now a group of people, maybe because of the atrocities and the craziness of the past, but there are fourth and fifth generation people born. A child is born screaming out of the womb, not having a clue what the fuck has happened prior to their existence. What are you going to do with that? This is a humanitarian thing at the moment. Yeah, some person needs to come and break the vicious cycle and say, this is a new era.
You're absolutely right. So I was just going to say one more thing. It's also more complicated because you've got people supporting Hamas, but you've got Iran supporting Hamas. Hamas are Sunni Muslims, Arab Sunni Muslims, whereas Iran are Shiite Persian, and they don't. That's a marriage of convenience and nothing more. And the same with Hezbollah and Hamas. So it's incredibly complicated. And you've got. So the question for me is, why did Hamas do what they did when they did it? And the answer is possibly that we were starting to see normalization talks between Saudi Arabia, Arab Sunnis, with Israel. And the Hamas attacks put a massive spanner in the works. Hamas don't want diplomacy. They don't want peace. They want the entire destruction of Israel. And this is a real problem because Hamas really are kind of terrorists. And so the solution to this has to be diplomatic, and it has to be allowing people the right to self-determination. And I don't think you can allow that with the existence of Gaza and West Bank. So you need a two-state solution where the Palestinians have literally physically more space than they have, or you need a one-state solution where everyone lives together in harmony. The problem is Hamas, but then you look at Northern Ireland, and diplomatically, we're a long way further forward now, where terrorists are no longer terrorists, and some terrorists are let out of prison, and it was horrible for the other side, and people didn't like it, but that's what peace does. So, for me, the only solution involves not having terrorists running governments. So it has to be a democratic diplomatic solution where all Palestinians have a right to self-determination and Israelis have a right to self-determination. But you're absolutely right. I keep likening it to, and I know this is probably an insult, but to my twins fighting. If I walk into the lounge and my twins are fighting, I say to them, you know, this doesn't stop. you know that when Finn does this, Oscar does that. When Oscar does that, Finn does that. And when Finn does that, Oscar does that. And this only escalates until one or both of you are in tears on the floor. That's the only way this ends, unless one of you is a bigger person, you stand back and you have to compromise. You don't get to retaliate and get your retribution. You have to bite that and you have to compromise. That's the only way we end this. And it never works. And they just end up crying on the floor. Now, this is Israel and Palestine, is that unless they step back and go, right, we need to stop this and we need to compromise, which means that neither side are going to be happy. The only solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict is that neither side will be happy.
Yeah,
and to make
it worse, Jonathan, is the end of days cult. So you've got some Jews believe that the Messiah will only come when the Jews are worthy again, and that's when they have to retrieve their promised land. You get the evangelists in the United States who believe the second coming of Jesus will happen when the temple is rebuilt and Israel is back to its glory. And then you have the Muslims who believe that the trees and the rocks at the end of days will start speaking to the Muslims, say, there is a Jew behind me, so you can kill him. So when you have screwed up people thinking like that...
Well, when you look at the Hamas Charter, have you ever looked at the Hamas Charter? I mean, like the Hamas Charter will never get you to a solution. So that's not... So terrorists won't do it. But likewise, when you look at the Netanyahu government and the right-wing zealots that are there, people like Shotrich, that's not going to work either. You need some kind of moderation in the middle, and hopefully there are Palestinians and Jews that want that enough to be able to forge.
Netanyahu is lapping it up. You know, he was almost out of the amount of demonstration before that war, but now he is the most popular because he's probably the right person for that kind of situation.
There's quite a lot of Jews that are actually blaming him for it as well. So it is quite interesting. He's not super popular as far as I can work out. Like,
yeah,
there are some people that said that his eye was off the ball. He was worrying too much about the judiciary and doing these kind of like culture wars stuff within Israel, so much to the point that Hamas were able to do what they did. But and in fact, the army don't really like him either. Which is interesting. So yeah,
no, it's not very popular, but he's going to be pragmatically needed at least for the short term, because he is kind of the military guy. He's the strong guy that he would actually put an end to this, rather than just a politician. You know, he's got his military gear and he's going into the field, and so. But this is sad.
This is a rally round a flag effect. So we saw this in 9/11, both with. Rudy Giuliani, but more pertinently with Bush. We saw this with Margaret Thatcher in 1982 and the Falklands War, because she was deeply unpopular and then like romped it. So this is what happened. So Netanyahu will no doubt get a rally round a flag effect.
Yeah, there's a movie that if you haven't watched, you've got to watch it. It's called Wag the Dog, by Dustin Hoffman and Robert De Niro.
They've created a war. Mentioned this before, and you told me to watch that. Yeah,
So it's a president whose sort of popularity is going down. So he gets a Hollywood director to create a war with a country that the Americans have never heard of. I think it was Kazakhstan. And you get all these rednecks sitting in bars wearing a T-shirt say "fuck Kazakhstan," and anyway, because they're suddenly with the president because he's in war. So it's the people are still easily led and quite easily swayed. We still have not. I mean, when I look at situations like this, 21st century, 2 wars happening at the same time, and I go, freaking hell, have we learned anything from the past?
Yeah, and the problem is that neither side are right in this, and they've both done horrific things, and people aren't able to hold that in their head. There's a great quote from Yuval Harari, who wrote Homo Sapiens and Homo Deus. He's a liberal Israeli, but he was like, I am really affected by this. This was just after Hamas did what they did, and for a liberal to come out and saying like, but that's the idea of the anger being so high in your mind you can't rationalize. But he said most people cannot comprehend that it is possible to be both a victim and a perpetrator at the same time. Yes. And that's so important, and I think that applies to both sides. And the problem is that around the world people are jumping on the this conflict at one end or the other with no nuance. And you're getting an awful lot of people in America, in the UK, in a lot of countries coming out in support of pro-Palestine. What I would say, the messaging is uncomfortable for that, because I can get on board with the pro-Palestine movement in absent of all the context at the moment, just as a kind of like, yeah, I understand, and I am basically pro-Palestine. But what Hamas did was so egregious that when you come out and say that right off the back of Hamas doing that, if you're not really clear and say, I'm pro-Palestine, but I'm anti-Hamas, then I think the messaging gets confused. And so people who have then seen the Hamas stuff and the videos that I've seen and the horrific stuff, look at the pro-Palestine movements going on and think of them as morally repugnant because they appear to be in support of Hamas. And I think if you don't have a really clear delineation between Hamas and pro-Palestine, then you end up adding to this like polarization, and I think it's possibly counterproductive. Whereas I am like, yeah, technically I'm pro-Palestine, I'm also kind of pro-Israel in like pro-people. Like,
Yeah.
I just want you all, like, you all are there, you all live in that area, right? So either one side entirely annihilates the other side and kills them so there's zero people left, right? Let's not have that happen. So, right, we need another solution. And it's either, okay, one's entire people move out of the entire area, but they've got to move somewhere else, right? So you're just moving the problem. Okay, so that's not great. So the next two solutions, one state solution or two state solutions, and that's it. So we've either got to have a one state solution or a two state solution, and everyone needs to get together and live in the same place in harmony. Now that's got to happen. We can't just keep bombing the shit out of each other, because that's not cool. And as someone said in the live chat earlier, it's the civilians that get it, right? And so we need to come together as an international community. But what's interesting is that this upsurge in support for the pro-Palestinian movement that we're seeing in a number of countries,
Mm-hmm.
and a bigger support than I was expecting, actually, a much more vocal support. And they've treated some Israeli students and Israeli people pretty badly. Like, there's some not very nice stuff going on. But there is a support for the pro-Palestinian movement, which means that we might start seeing, because what you want is part of the world to be supporting Israel and part of the world to support Palestine. And if you have much more balance there, then you're more likely to get a balanced solution. And I think you're more likely to see that going forward, because there are more people to support Palestine than I think there previously were. I don't know.
Yeah. Then the answer will be a compromise for both, and then freaking live life, because life is too short, and imagining the quality of life. Like, what's the point of living in misery for the rest of your life? I mean, just I never understood that. I don't know why humans do that to themselves. You try to savor every day and trying to see your kids to school and be happy, but it seems to be there's some people are still thrive on misery of others. It's incredible.
Gaza, 25 square kilometers, three exits, three entrance, three ways in to a wall where Israel gets to control the power, the water, and basically the food, the energy. Like, that's an open air prison camp. That's not good, right? So that needs to be solved. So there needs to be compromises on both sides. Sort it out. But then,
easier said than done. I mean, we'll see then. Yeah, I think we're probably going to have a second part, and especially as events develop, let's sort of see what's going to happen over the next few weeks. But as ever, I'm a big fan. I enjoy the thinking on your feet. Nothing is ever prepared. You like to be surprised, and you like to even be shocked at new ideas and then react, just like me. So I love it, and I love you for that, Jonathan.
I really appreciate you inviting me on, mate, and thank you. Thanks to all your listeners, and please support Hanney and his great channel.
Thank you very much. And obviously, guys, you know Jonathan by now. This is not the first gig we had. So all the description of all his great videos and his great channel in the description of the video. Please follow him. He does cover all sort of things from the existence of God to the Ukrainian and Russian war and beyond. So please have a look and have a look at some of the great videos he prepares. Thank you, Jonathan. Would you like to say anything before we finish?
I guess the last thing to say is how best can we help? And I guess the easiest thing that everyone can do to help is get a really good grasp of the history and the politics that has taken place up until now, rather than jump on to looking at video images of bombs going off and of Hamas, of Palestinian civilians getting blown up and Hamas killing Israelis, innocent Israelis, and get yourself incensed by either of those things. Try and understand the whole background to how those two sides got to where they've got to, and then you're armed with the tools of knowledge.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. I'm back, so the next few days and weeks will be more conversation, philosophy, science, all the good stuff you like. I've changed a lot of ideas about the way I want to approach things, and maybe this is a conversation between because probably, Jonathan, I'll feel more comfortable confessing my new revelation to you, because you're probably going to set me straight. Yeah, I'll probably convey all the epiphanies that I've come across in my solitude and my 6 months away from social media in the days to come. Thanks very much, and I'll check you out later, guys. See ya.